Greetings. We are now at week 7. Can you believe it? Time flies when you're having fun. And this week we'll be talking about human security and gendered theories. Now, these shouldn't be new to you. You should remember them from our securitization chapter looking at referent objects. So human security, gendered approaches, they do not discuss realist or liberal notions of security, not even Marxist notions of security, um, in its unique class warfare form. But they do, like Marxist theories and historical materialist theories, they want to return the focus to the individual. So when we talk about human security, we're talking about individual security. Um, So the referent object is not the state, it is the individual. That's why I'd like, if you need to know more about it, go back to the securitization and try to get a good foundation there. But the concept of national security is very specific in the sense of it looks at the state and state survival with regard to the theory of realism. So we're not looking at militaries. We're not looking at sovereignty or autonomy or anything like that. We're not talking about nuclear weapons. We're not talking about weapons in general. What we're talking about here is individual deaths, and individuals can die from a number of problems, a number of issues like natural disasters, climate change, disease, exploitation, um, anything really. Human beings can die from a multiplicity of ways. So the things that we have to take away is that it is a multi-dimensional theory. It looks at a number of different issues, and it is very global in nature and global in scope. They look at human rights and human dignity. So they're leaving the military issues aside. They're leaving the soldiers and how to conduct warfare, and they're looking specifically at individuals. So, if you look around the world, there's a number of different places that are experiencing human insecurity. In some countries, like right in Africa, in Latin America, there's a lot of poverty, and poverty leads to starvation, and starvation leads to death. Um, in countries in the Middle East, like in what's going on in Iran right now, there's a number of protests, and these protests are for the betterment of women's rights in that society. And so, if you look at the amount of deaths coming from the protests in Iran, we're looking at 400 people. So women's position in society is part of that, and that's going to tie into the gendered approaches. We're also looking at ecological destruction, environmental degradation. Uh, that ties into living and livelihood of the climate, of the environment. If you look at climate change, the more climate changes in terms of getting, let's say, the weather will get more hot, then that's going to lead to the polar ice caps melting, and ultimately a lot of coastal regions will be underwater. Um, Also, education is important. Access to education, women's access to education. In Afghanistan, that was always a problem, even with the United States presence in Afghanistan. And all of that is human security. So it's a very broad understanding of security. It's a very broad understanding. And realists argue against this sort of the notion of human security, looking at rather looking at state security and saying without the state, the individual is made unsafe. The problem with that critique is that if you look at the like budgets, right? There was a great article by Marilyn Waring in the 1970s called "The Value of Death." And the value of death is about looks at budgets, a state's budget, Ethiopia's budget. And Ethiopia at the time was fighting a terrible civil war, and I believe war with Somalia. And the money that was used to fight the war was not used to help with some of the human issues, like the lack of food, the famine that was going on. And so a lot of individuals died just to keep the sovereign state of Ethiopia afloat. And so human security is a critique of that. It says that the state is supposed to protect the individual. So if the individual is not protected, then what is the purpose of the state? So what is the purpose of the state if military security trumps individual security? So this imaginary idea of a state, this social construction of a state, it supersedes the individual. And because of that, individuals are made worse off. Even if you look at the military budgets for the United States, the military budget is so large that it pushes aside money for medical and for education and for other human needs, right? We have like rampant starvation. I think 1 in 5 or 1 in 6 children, one in 6 children starve. They don't have enough money for breakfast. They skip a meal, and that is not a sign of a healthy society. Yet we have an amazing military. So you explain that. Like, help me understand how both these things can work together. So it is about social justice and human rights and economic freedom and environmental awareness. So it's very broad. And the realist critique of that would be, well, if it's broad, so broad, then what's the point of even studying what's the point of security if it's so broad, right? It goes back to the lack of a coherent theoretical view of the securitization literature in, I believe, week 3. So this trade-off is essential to understand the makeup of security in the modern world today. So if you go forward, right, human security, it's a great field. It's a great concept because it deals with everything that destroys and affects the individual. So if the individual is, let's say, suffering because of poverty or economic underdevelopment or environmental degradation, lack of human rights, what's the point of the state if the state is not solving these things? So if we're so busy fighting wars in Ukraine, what about the individual suffering, right? Why do countries go to war anyway? And I think realism is a great theory, but it doesn't explain some of those questions. And I think in order to really understand security, we're going to have to open up the fields. We're going to look at other theories. And that's where gendered approaches come in. Now, you read this chapter before, I think, gender and security, but I think it's worth a revisit. So patriarchy, this idea of patriarchy, it's not about the rule of men per se, right? It's more about how security is, how can I say this? Security is based on the experiences of men. So realism, primarily, most of the scholars that created or invented realism, these were men, like Hans Morgenthau, E.H. Carr, Kenneth Waltz. They're all men, and these theories are based on the experiences of men. So where are the women? Women are not really included. Their contributions are not part of that realist tradition, and that's because in many ways the women are sidelined, and war is a man's game. So with that, in saying that, it's crucial to get women into the security studies field. So in that doing so, the field of security studies can change a bit more and change and incorporate some of these gender inequalities. And gender inequalities, it's not a biological thing. It's more of a social construction, the differences between men and women. So feminists tend to distinguish between sex and gender. So, like we said before in, I think, previous class or previous reading, that gender is a social construction and sex is biological. And so, because of this, social codes create concepts or create expectations. So, Simone de Beauvoir, one of those amazing uh, feminist scholars, she once said that um, a woman is not, you're not born a woman, you're made into one, and that reflects the gender, the social construction aspect of the gendered approach. I think that's important to understand and distinguish, make that distinction when looking at that. So if indeed, if gender is a social construction, then that means that realism is a social construction. It's a product of the experiences of men, and because of this, we live in a security is a man's thing. Notions of masculinity, the bravery, sacrifice, all of that is needed, but at the same time, it's sometimes not conducive to human security, which is a very different term. So we're examining ways to make the world more safe, ways to make the world safer by including women, bringing women in, and realizing that, yeah, it's not about a zero-sum world, that cooperation might exist. Now, that itself is a social construction. And if you look at women in the past, you have Margaret Thatcher, you have Indira Gandhi, you have Golda Meir. All of these women are take on masculinist traits in order to be treated seriously in a man's world, in a man's sort of area, which is security. Now, that's a lot to unpack. So, what I mean here is that to survive or to become successful in the field of security as a woman, to rise, above the ranks, to be treated seriously, taken seriously, a woman has to prove herself, to say, I can be in this seat. And this is part of what patriarchy is, this structure of that creates behavior, creates expectations. And it's in that we have the negative sum, what Buzan calls negative sum. Nobody wins in that sort of environment. If you go and you further read more of that gendered analysis, you realize that notions of masculinity, the protection, security, safety, all of that it's intrinsic to our way of life. And there's a great article, Carol Cohn, The World of the Defense Intellectuals. I can't remember the exact name of the article, but she's a feminist and she goes to study defense intellectuals in where they house nuclear silos for weapons, missiles. And she goes there and she realizes that she actually feels a lot safer with these defense intellectuals. There's something about them that they're very calming and very comforting, and ultimately she begins to be lured and seduced into, and I use that word on purpose, seduced, because as the article progresses, you realize that the men in the article, they use sex as a coping mechanism. And so Carol Cohn looks at the sexualization of missiles, the civilian as a feminine, a woman, sort of someone to be protected, whereas the defense intellectual, the soldier, they're the masculine, they're the brave, they're the man that protects. So there you see these notions of gender being reproduced in the security literature, and I think that Carol Cohn does a great job in illustrating these ideas. I think she did a fabulous job in that article. There's other areas of war and politics that is essentially a feminist question. So, for example, the issue of rape as a weapon, where during the Yugoslavian wars in the 1990s, the wars in Yugoslavia, we have former Yugoslavia, obviously. We have rape as a weapon, where both sides would rape the women of the other country, and basically illustrate their lack of masculinity, the lack of, well, you can't protect your own women from being raped. You're not worth. You're not a man. So these notions are brought forth in some of the in the conduct of war. You're not man enough to protect. You're not strong enough to protect the most vulnerable in your society. And then there's the issue of women in the military, which is a completely different issue altogether, where women and women's issues are being appropriated by the women to gain by women's issues are being appropriated by the military in order to legitimize their position, even as they do damage and they affect the lives of women in other countries. So recent recruitment videos for the CIA, the FBI, as a side note, but also in the military, it goes to show that norms of feminist understandings of security can be taken and appropriated by the state in order to be legitimized. So it's not simply to bring the women in, but it's also to show that it's about norms. So it's not simply about making women present. Hillary Clinton is a woman, so we should elect her. No, it's not about that. It's about looking at the norms that perpetuate masculine understandings of security. So that's important to study. Now, a great article that was influential to me in my development was the one I included in today. It's Astrid Sukri's Human Security and the Interests of States. And it gives you a quick summary of the notion of human security. And I think it's a good article just to go through, because it shows you that development of what we just spoke about. So do take your time and read this about human security, and note that it's about protecting the most vulnerable in our society. So it's not about protecting the state, but it's about women and children. So if women and children are safe, if they feel secure, if they're free from starvation, if they have access to education, if they're free from sexual violence, if they have a place to live, if there's shelter, there's an absence of vulnerabilities, then ultimately, because the most vulnerable are secure, the world would be a better place. The world would be a better place to live in. So it's less about emphasizing military security, and it's more about the individual. And that's the difference between state security, national security, and human security. All of this is part of that development of the securitization literature, looking at different referent objects. So if you have a different referent object, if you are focusing on an individual, obviously your answers, your recommendations are not going to be very different from the state version. So this should be a really nice overview of what you've done so far in previous weeks, but just going a bit deeper. And with that, I think that it's a pretty straightforward piece. It's a short reading week, and I hope everybody's doing well, and see you later. Thank you.